Okay, let's talk a little bit about relative font sizing. And for that, we're going to take a look at font size before that HTML. And it's located in the same folder as the previous file. Now, there are two units of measurement that are relative that we're going to talk about, and that is percent and ems. Let's start with percent. First of all, let's specify that our body tag should have font size of 120%. And what that means is that we want to take whatever the default size is, and by default I mean whatever the browser provides by default, and increase it by 120%. You could actually do a quick calculation and figure out what pixel size that would be. Most browsers have 16 pixels as default text size, so 120% of 16 would be a little bit over 19 pixels. So if we refresh the page, we'll see that we increased the font size in the entire HTML document. Let's now target the very first text here that says 2M text. So let's go ahead and actually use an inline style since we're just testing and specify the font size to be 2M. And M is a unit of measurement that is equivalent to the width of the letter M in this particular font that we're using. It sounds a little bit confusing at first, but the bottom line is it's a relative size. It's relative to something. And for this div where it says 2M text, what this is saying is it's relative to whatever the font size is at the moment we're applying it. Since we set the font size to 120% in the entire body, this div also received that 120%. And when you combine this font size with this one, this basically says I want to increase the font 2 times of whatever 120 was. So if we take a look at this text, this 2M text should really increase twice as large as this word regular text. So if we save the file and refresh, and you could see now everything, since that div includes the other divs, they got increased. That looks just about right, that it's twice the size of the regular text. Now you might find this confusing. Didn't we just override the font size and say it's 2M? Why is 120% playing together with 2M instead of having 2M override the 120%? And that's kind of the game of the relative sizing. When you specify them on subsequent elements, they don't have an overriding effect, they have a cumulative effect instead. Because what you're saying here is, whatever the size of this div is, I want you to increase it, or I want you to make 2M's out of it, meaning make it twice as large. So I'm sure you guessed now, how do I make this 4M text actually 4M? If I specify style and say font size, what should I put here? Should I put 4M? Well, that would be a mistake. If I put 4M, it will really be the 2M that's already applying to this times 4M, which would make it 8M, right? But what we actually need to do is put 4M. In order to do that, I just specify 2M again. So it means that this 4M text will be twice as large as the 2M text right here. So let's save the file and refresh. And you can see now it's twice as large and this 2M. This text also got caught into this because it is a child element of our div that we just styled. So how do I make it 2M again? Well, the answer is you don't overwrite it, you just decrease it. So let's go ahead and say style, font size, and in order to get back to 2M, I need to half the size of my text. So in order to do that, I'll just say 0.5M, and now when I refresh, my text now is back to the same size as it was before because I halved the relative size of 4M. Couple of more quick points before we finish up. First, it's a pretty common practice that if you want to increase the font size in the entire document, that you specify percentage and you apply it usually to the most parent tag, which is usually the body tag. And technically speaking, you could have continued to use percentages even here. So 2M really translates to 200%. So if I put 200% right here and save it and refresh, you could see nothing really changed. However, it's more common to use ems when you're talking about relative sizes within the document itself. But one thing you should know is that even though you could use percentages here, I highly recommend you don't mix and match the percentage ems and certainly not the absolute value units all over the place. It could get very confusing and it'll become a mess. So it's better to keep things consistent. Point number 2 is, even though we increased the font size here to 120, using CSS rule, a user of your website can do the same thing just by increasing the zoom. For example, here, I'll increase the zoom a couple of times. As you can see, I'm all the way to 200% zoom. And hopefully now you see the value of having relative units of measurement for font size. You could see that the visual size relationship between these different divs remains the same even though they're all now very big. This text is still half of this text, and this text is still half of this text.